Hi students, we're here today to talk about the Middle Ages. This is a very broad period of time ranging from the fall of Rome in 476 until the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century. We are going to now begin by speaking and looking into a religion that comes on the scene in the early 600s called Islam. One of the things that I've always found fascinating about Islam is the core foundation and principle that other prophets had come before Muhammad. So we see Muhammad is born in Mecca in 570, but the religion believes that other great religious and historic figures were also prophets that had come to earth to send and share the message of God, or Allah, as is called in Islam. The term Islam itself means this idea of surrendering to God, surrendering yourself to God, and was founded by Muhammad in 622. That is the year he fled Medina for religious persecution, and that is considered the beginning of the Islamic calendar. He dies in 661. The core principles of Islam are that you have this direct relationship with God. So your prayer happens between you and God. And they believe the idea of idol worship, something that we see frequently in Christianity, where we see symbols of the cross, symbols of the Virgin Mary, the saints, Christ. Any of those images that are used to represent God create this false idol, this sense that you're worshiping an object or something else that you're giving attention to rather than giving that attention to God. And as a result, their art is largely what we call non-figurative. So it's very organic, often focusing on images from nature. And as we'll see, calligraphy, so taking something like writing and creating this incredibly involved, articulate, and beautiful art with it. The holy book is called the Quran. You see two different ways of spelling it here, but we pronounce it Quran. And here is an early example of Islamic calligraphy. And you can see not only is the lettering itself incredibly beautiful, but the painting and the decorative motifs that fill it in add additional beauty to it. The Dome of the Rock is a site that was built in approximately the 7th century, and it encloses a rock outcropping that fascinatingly is important to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it's based on the historic architecture of the martyria, so these round buildings that we saw as baptistries and mausoleums for the martyred. So they're built in the round. They often have blind niches, so those little depressed alcoves that historically would have held things like statues, but become this architectural motif. And the whole thing was gilded in gold leaf. One of the things that Islamist architects and builders were trying to do was to draw people away from Christianity, to create this dazzling, magnificent, attention-getting space. And we can see that they did that quite successfully here. The gilded dome on top, the frieze that wraps around the top, that top area with the blue writing, that is all Islamic calligraphy with passages from the Quran. We can see borrowed architectural features, as I mentioned, the blind niches, the colonnade in order to enter into the building itself, and the interior, highly ornate, decorative motifs, the ablask, which is the alternating brick pattern. So we see that here in the archways. That's a very traditional Islamic method that's applied often in some of these large-scale structures. You can see the detailed mosaics, the heavily ornated columns, and the marble, the highest texture and color to it. In a mosque, we see a very different approach than we see in Christian churches. So to begin, Christian churches are ornated on the cardinal axis, so facing north, south, east, west. And in contrast, a mosque is something that is always facing towards Mecca. So if it's a mosque here in the United States or a mosque somewhere in the Middle East, no matter where it is oriented towards Mecca. The buildings themselves were originally based on the courtyard of Muhammad's home in Medina. So they had these open hypostyle courtyards, a heavy Egyptian influence that has continued to carry into them. Inside the mosque itself, there are three features that I'd like for you to be aware of. First is the Qibla wall. This is the wall that tells you which direction Mecca is. It's generally the most highly ornamented. You can see the mosque is oriented towards the space on the inside. On that wall, there is something called a mihrab, and this is a niche. It's a little open space in the Qibla wall. It's traditionally kept empty, and we see something similar to this in historic synagogues, early synagogues, which we'll look at a little later. On the outside of these mosques, because Muslims are invited to prayer 5 times a day, and historically you might not have a watch with you, or before timekeeping was as easy as we have it now, callers or criers would go to the top of these towers, and we'll see a few examples of that shortly, called minarets, in order to call out to the community to invite them to wherever they are, pause, either go to their closest mosque or do their own prayer in their home if they're unable to. This is the Great Mosque in Cordoba, Spain. You can see the large enclosed courtyard. And as we enter the inside, we see these double arches. A lot of these columns were salvaged from Roman and Christian buildings, the double high horseshoes, and the red and brick, a black pattern that I mentioned, the red and white brick, a black pattern that I mentioned already. So these are all characteristics of mosques in general, and specifically the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Now, when we're inside the space here, when you think about the contrast of this to a Christian church, it's very dense and closed in the sense that these columns create a sense of intimacy and privacy, even though the space is made to be open. One of the things that I find interesting about this and this example of a mosque specifically is the difference between Christian and Islamic places of worship. In Islam, the idea is that you do have a prayer leader that's leading potentially the community in prayer, but you are praying intimately, directly with Allah, the God. And in Christian churches, they are made to hold service. So you have a priest up front performing a ritual, acting out a play, and the idea is that you're focusing on the priest specifically and the priest's ritual specifically. Here's the Qibla wall and mihrab, and again you can see that this would be the most ornamented space inside the mosque. Now, when we look at something like a dome, in Christian churches, we would see generally a picture of Christ, often in the pantocrator pose, so somebody painting Christ as somebody that was all knowledgeable, all powerful, kind of like the Father of all of us in the sky. And in contrast here, we see intricate geometry and patterns being the focus. And you can see underneath the dome, underneath that scalloped edge of the dome, the intricate Islamic calligraphy. As Islam was developing in the Middle East and Near East, on European continents, we have the development of the Anglo-Saxon people. These were Germanic tribes that had invaded England and Wales and settled there. Their work is incredibly unique. This is what we think of as the Viking era. These are the people of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, England, Wales. Their art that they created is something that is very specific to that geographical region. And there's 3 terms I'd like for you to have here that will carry forward into our next few slides, as well as the video that I've posted for you to watch this week on the Sutton Hoo ship burial. The first is a term called closion. This is something you saw in our early Christian lecture from last week. So this is crushed precious stone that's inlaid in gold metalwork. Interlace patterning. These are looped, braided, and knotted complex geometric patterns. And the idea of animal style, this is something we see dating back to as early as the early Egyptians when we think about the palette of Narmer. some of the figures on the back of the palette. These are animal bodies that are divided into sections. They're designed, stylistic, and have very little sense of naturalism to them. This is the purse cover from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, and again, you'll be watching a half-an-hour film on that this week. But you can see all these complex terms coming together here. We have closion, so that's the overall way that this is made. You can see the crushed gemstones inlaid into that gold. We have the interlace and animal style, so almost thinking of it as what we see today with Celtic knotwork, so these complex shapes coming together. This is an image of the Sutton Hoo ship burial. This region was ruled by many different kings ruling small areas. Often they were descended from royal families elected to power. By 800, they had developed sailing ships that were propelled by oars. There's evidence of travel to France, Britain, Greenland, and even North America. There's a woman named Miss Edith Pretty. She was a landowner that had just lost her husband, and she asked Basil Brown, a local amateur archaeologist, to excavate this large mound that was on her property. There's a lot of myths surrounding these mounds, as you'll see in the film, to do with ghosts on horseback. And what he found was an incredibly ornate and intricate burial. So there was silverware, gold jewelry, feasting sets, and famously an iron helmet, which you'll see in that film. This dates back to as early as the 600s, and this burial commemorated someone that must have been a leading figure in the movement. The earliest story we have recorded in the English language is a story about a hero named Beowulf. And this early manuscript is an epic, like we saw when we were studying the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, an epic in two parts. The first is the hero offers service to the king of Denmark, whose home is being ravaged by the monster Grendel. And in the second part of the epic, Beowulf becomes king. He's reflecting in his old age. He's mortally wounded and buried. One of the wonderful things that we get to see when we look at art history and archaeology with this lens of kind of zoomed out time is we get to see stories repeat. So when we talk about the Scandinavian cosmos, the beginning of Earth is a great icy abyss, this idea of a flood and people surviving, similar to the Noah story. There's a giant race of giants that dies. They only leave one heir that goes on to father a new race, similar to the myths of the Olympians and the giants of the Greeks. These giants intermarried with gods. Polytheism, of course, so we have more than one god. Paganism. The chief god is Odin. He schedules seasons, the sun, the moon, orders the world into a tricentric structure that is made of three parts. The Asgard, which is the dwelling of the gods, Midgard, which is the region that we inhabit, and Utgard, the outer earth, as well as the outer earth and the home of the giants. This is an image that represents a warrior entering Valhalla, or the heaven. It's the great hall that everyone hopes to go to when they pass away. The warrior is riding Odin's eight-legged horse named Sleipnir. And Odin himself, he was the god of wisdom. He creates the first human couple. On the side of the image, right in the middle next to Sleipnir, there's a Valkyrie, these maiden-like creatures that would greet you. She extends a drinking horn to this fallen warrior. And beneath on the bottom is a Viking ship filled with warriors. You can see that interlace stylized imagery surrounding the whole stone. Slowly we begin to see Christianity creeping into this region of the world, and we have the birth of Hiberno-Saxon art. Those are the isles off of northern Britain, escaped occupation by the Romans as well as invasion by the Germanic tribes. But in the early 5th century, St. Patrick is to have come and brought Christianity to this place. The resulting artwork is varied, but one of the things, the relics that have been left to us, is a tradition of manuscript illumination. So these are hand-decorated pages of text. often deeply symbolic, and iconography is rich in them. And these are some pieces of iconography that I'd like for you to get down in your notes. When we see these images, we have a sense of what they mean. So the lion represents Saint Mark, the idea that he preaches like a lion, roaring courage, open eyes while sleeping. This is something we saw in Egyptian art as well as ancient Near Eastern art. The bull is St. Luke, a symbol of sacrifice, service, and strength. The man, St. Matthew, he shared Jesus' genealogy from Abraham. This is a symbol of Christ's human side, his side that binds us in blood. The eagle, St. John, the eagle is believed to be able to stare into the sun, and it's a symbol of Christians being able to look towards eternity in heaven. We see the input of the earlier Saxon art and the interlace patterning, as well as the animal style here, the lion symbolizing St. John. Normally the lion would symbolize St. Mark, but this was an early rendition. We see these illuminated manuscripts evolve, and one thing to remember is that everything that was copied had to be hand copied. So as they're copying and sharing the word of God in this way, they are trying to communicate multiple things, multiple layers in one image. This is the Tunc Crucifixerent, and this is a reference to the death of Christ and Christ hanging on the cross with two thieves next to him. We often see the symbols XPI or the letters XPI. These are the beginning of Christ's name in the ancient Greek language. We see here in this image the interlace and animal style, and in this case the animals are dragons breathing fire, these serpent-like creatures breathing fire. Tucked into the side of the image, you can see these human heads, these observants watching what is happening. From the fall of Rome and Emperor Constantine's time forward, we see the building of the power of Christianity and the Catholic Church. Emperor Charlemagne was one of these leaders. He was both a leader of the European people, also a leader in the Catholic Church, and he really united much of Europe under his rule. He commissions 3 manuscripts during his time. We see in this image Christ, so Christ, this mainstay character in Christianity. He's very frontal, facing us directly. He has his hand in a gesture of blessing. Surrounding his head is something you're probably familiar with, this idea of a halo. So that will indicate to us as we move into Romanesque art as well, that there's a holy character at the center point. He has behind him what we call the Greek cross, so that plus sign behind his head that evolves into what we think of as the elongated Christian cross. The figure itself is very flattened, two-dimensional, lacks perspective. So his feet are on a platform. We're seeing the top of his feet, the top of his lap, the front of his legs. The perspective is all a bit off. You can see in the background some sort of fortified structure, the ramparts behind him, interlace patterns woven into the edge of the image. Another very different image. This is St. John, another manuscript of Charlemagne, far more naturalized. You see the architectural building behind it. And again, we really don't have strong architectural perspective until the Renaissance comes in. But you see an attempt here at showing this figure a little more grounded into his seat. You see his feet on a little box, and that box is popping out into the frame. So this idea that this figure is coming out of the image to us. Again, with the halo, the hint at nature, the importance of humans being with nature, with the trees on top. And in another very different perspective, we have an image of the 4 evangelists. These are the terms we talked about at the beginning of this image set. So we have Mark shown with the lion at his side, the bull with Luke, man with Matthew, and the eagle with John. And these evangelists are all shown in the action of writing their pieces for those first chapters of the New Testament in the Bible. Our last image we see today is another image of the 4 evangelists. You can see them surrounding Christ, Christ in the center, and a flattened circle. This full body halo, this is a term we'll talk about in our next lecture for Romanesque in a little more detail. This is called a mandorla. So the mandorla, rather than just the halo on the head, the whole body is in halo. He's surrounded again by the evangelists doing their work, so sitting and doing their writing. The poses and even the footstools, everything is exaggerated, lacking perspective, tied together with geometry rather than space. So they're not all in space together. They're all kind of adrift in their own little thought bubbles. That's all for this week. I hope you have a lovely week, and we'll be back with our next lecture on the Romanesque next week.